What's up, hobby friends? My name is Casey, and this is eBay Miniature Rescues. This week, I tackle a severely messed up Eldar Wraithknight. Alright, so there I was browsing eBay and I saw a listing that immediately caught my eye. It is straight up listed as the WORST Wraithknight. See, not too long ago I put out a video that had a very similar title. So the first thing I thought was, somebody's messing with me. Either way, the listing got my attention and I had to take a look. Already I can tell that there are some problems. The worst kind of problems. We'll have to find out when it gets here in the mail, because of course I bought it. Now the thing is, whether or not the model is salvageable, a Wraithknight seems like a really nice thing to have. I've been collecting Eldar models since my early days in playing Warhammer. It was the first army that I bought and the very first models that I ever painted, so getting one of these fancy Wraithknights just makes sense. Besides the challenge of fixing and painting one of these in a relatively short amount of time, is that I might actually be able to use my old Eldar army in a game. Eldar models really haven't changed in the last 20 years, and pretty much all of my models are still viable today. So being able to have a playable Wraithknight sounds pretty amazing. I do wonder though, did I shoot myself in the foot a little bit? Heading to eBay and taking a look at current prices. I bought this model for 53 bucks, and normally they sell for around 120 on the eBay market, and 140 direct from Games Workshop. Obviously the one I bought has the possibility of not being playable, but let's check the other prices and see where I landed. At the time of recording, there are actually quite a few listings under 100 bucks. Some are better than others, and all of them are nicer than the one I bought. Still, there's some good variety if you are looking into a model like this. Mostly put together models, some without paint, which is pretty nice, and some with some alright paint jobs. So I technically got a good deal, but only because of the condition. If I were going to add another one of these models to my army, I'd probably just pay the 120 bucks and get a new kit. That way I had all the weapon options as well, because for most of these, what you see is what you get. When the model finally came in the mail, I was pretty excited. I've never actually seen one of these minis in person. Even though I've owned a lot of Eldar stuff, it's just not something I've seen much out in the wild. Opening the package, you can already start to see some of the problems we're gonna have to face. First off, the base is pretty much unusable. Besides the stuff that's actually on it, there's another base glued on the bottom of it. I assume it was for weight, but they are really stuck together. The main weapon actually looks like it's in really good condition, and the primer isn't thick at all, so that's kind of a nice bonus. Getting in a little deeper, I can see exactly what happened on this project. It's all clear to me now. There is green stuff absolutely everywhere on this model. The previous owner attempted to magnetize all of the parts, and things got a little out of hand. Now I know what you're thinking, the last owner of this model may not have known better, or this was their first attempt. And that's probably true, but in order to get a little more info, I decided to message the seller of this model and ask what the deal was. I was a little surprised, but I actually got a message back pretty quick. The story goes that the guy I bought this model from actually bought this and a bunch of other models in a large Warhammer lot off of Facebook Marketplace. There wasn't any description of this particular model, only that it was included. So this one and a ton of other models he got for what I'm assuming was a pretty good deal, he picked through the lot to keep what he wanted and sold the rest on eBay, which is how it made it onto my desk. Pretty crazy how far these models travel and through how many hands. I've definitely been in a place where I've given up on a project like this, where you think it's going to turn out a certain way and it just doesn't really come together. All we can hope is that the original owner went out the next day and picked up something even better and is still hobbying today. If you happen to know that person, let me know down in the comments. I will say one thing on top of this. The paint job isn't half bad. The paint isn't overly thick, and there was some thought put into how everything was going to be painted, probably to match a custom Eldar color scheme. Most of the work that will have to be done is going to be repairing the joints. All of them are filled with green stuff, and unfortunately there's a good amount of super glue on the plastic. So let's get this model stripped and get going on the repairs. Starting with an X-Acto blade, I went in and scraped away as much of the excess green stuff and glue as I could without damaging the plastic. Once I got down really close to plastic, I came in with some sanding sticks and tried to smooth out the surfaces. For the most part, this actually got pretty much everything looking like normal, although there were still large deposits of green stuff in the hips and the feet. For those, I drilled out what I could and tried to shape the rest to fit the ball joints that the model needs to be attached. While I was working on cleaning up this model, I was really trying to think of a way to get this guy to have a more dynamic pose, something out of the norm and not so static. What ended up helping me out in the end was actually the sponsor of this week's video. My Mini Factory just launched the crowdfunding campaign for Fantastic Plants and Rocks 2 by Print Your Monsters, which is a 3D printable set of scatter terrain and basing materials. There are a ton of, you may have guessed it, plants and rocks that you can print out at home. The core set includes 20 different sets of plants and rocks, which represents 100 different STL files, which come supported for super easy click and print action. Seeing as the base on my new Wraithknight needed a redo, I went ahead and printed out some of the Martian cliffs and enchanted obelisks that come with this campaign, and I thought that would give this base a really cool story. I can honestly say that the quality of these sculpts is top notch, and the variety of models was enough to really get me thinking about different projects. The campaign is currently underway and funded, but there are still some really great stretch goals to unlock and build that collection to even greater heights. So check out the link in the description below and join in on a great campaign. And for viewers of this channel, there will be a 5% off code for your pledge also in the description below. And thank you My Mini Factory for supporting miniature painters. So now that I have some sweet terrain for my base, let me show you how I decided to pose this guy and fill out the rest of that base. I really wanted my knight to be pushing himself off of a rock, almost like he's about to strike an oncoming enemy. I also had this little story narrative of him guarding an old Eldar gravesite. So I threw in an obelisk that has all these little vines and flowers on it onto the base. I posed the legs onto the base and got everything solidified in my mind. Then I drilled holes into the feet that fit paper clips. I held those pinned feet onto the areas of the base where they would go and marked those areas for drilling. Since there was a ton of play in the legs, I could get away with not being perfect with the pins. So I drilled the holes and tested it out. I am really happy with the way that the pose is going. It's extremely triumphant looking and exactly what I wanted. So I glued the paper clips into place and started working on filling out the rest of the base. Using PVA, I cover the rest of the base and dip that into beach sand. I also let some of the glue go up onto those 3D printed pieces, and that really ties them into the rest of the base. The cool thing about the plants and rocks set is that all of the terrain is pretty much on a base of its own. So you can include it on a base like I'm doing and they really stand out nicely, or just put them directly onto the tabletop and they're pretty much ready to go. Once the glue dried, I hit the whole thing with black primer. This sealed everything in and got us ready for some paint. As far as the base goes, I want there to be some contrast between the rocks and the rest of the base and model. Because my army mostly falls in the Bale Tan camp for Eldar, I'm going to shoot for a strong green and white theme for the model. A lot like these guardians I painted up a while ago on the channel. Check it out up here if you haven't seen it. So going with a desaturated red rock seems like it will bring a good amount of that contrast without looking too ridiculous. From there, I used a static grass applicator to apply a nice variety of grasses onto the base. Much like the sand, I covered some of the rock to make it look like the landscape is all one cohesive piece. And I finished it off with some grass tufts from Army Painter. I came in and painted some of the extra details that were poking out and gave the rocks a real quick dry brush of white to really bring out that detail. I've gotta say, this is probably the nicest base I've ever made. The printed parts add so much to what's going on, especially since I used to just go with kind of cork and bark and sand. This is a real game changer for me, and it couldn't have come at a better time. Seriously though, thank you, My Mini Factory and Print Your Monsters, for sponsoring this video, because I really don't think that this would have looked half as good without that. Now that the base is done, it's time to move on to the model. I really don't have a lot in mind other than green and white, and for the most part this model is broken up into a few different pieces, the body and the armor. So I want to do white for the panels and green for the body. I also want the weapons to be a real focal point, so I'm thinking some kind of fancy teal would do really well with everything. Give the weapons a nice glow. First thing we need to do though is get some white ink into the airbrush and highlight this model. I decided on a transparent green ink to cover everything, so picking out raised details and placing highlights now will give us the final look almost right away. At first I do a light coat from above and then come in a little closer to boost the opacity of specific areas. On the chest I focus on the center, making sure not to let any of that ink overspill that bend. That way there's a nice highlight on the piece facing the sky and a noticeable darkness on the lower panel. Really, it's a matter of holding the model in just the right way. The airbrush only sprays in a straight line, like a flashlight. It doesn't bend corners. So in order to get a clean line on the chest, I just have to put my airbrush in such a position that it can't see the other part of the model. For me, thinking about the airbrush like a flashlight makes it so much easier to envision how something will turn out. The next time you pick up your airbrush, pretend like you're shining a flashlight at your model and see what happens. Next up is filtering with our transparent ink and paints. For the body, I went with a nice rich green, and it really worked out nicely. The green is just the right tone for the Eldar that I want, so I'm pretty excited about that. After all of that ink dried, I then came in with some yellow just to kind of boost that color. You know, a little bit of yellow over the green just punches it up in some of those highlights. For the main weapon, I sprayed a power weapon pattern. Since this sword is really big, I wanted to exaggerate that look, and I did this by spraying white onto the blade in a top to bottom pattern. One spray on the top half of the blade, move over a little bit, spray on the bottom, and so on until the blade is covered. I also mirrored it onto the other side of the blade to get that nice symmetrical look. For color, I mixed up some golden high flow green and blue into a nice teal color. I wanted the blades to have that glowing effect, and I've always found that this color does really well for me. As a final touch for the blades, I came back in with some white and built up transitions on each of those glowing areas to really make them stand out. Ooh, this is really cool. If you have ever needed to mask something off and it has a complicated shape, go get yourself some silly putty, like the toy. It is awesome for masking off things on your models. It won't tear up the paint and is completely reusable. I haven't had a good reason to use it in a while, but this helmet was perfect for it. I just filled in the main section and used my airbrush to get that nice opaque white that would have taken years with a paintbrush. Once it dries, I can just peel back the silly putty and put it away. Of course, I didn't really end up going with this look exactly, but the masking trick was too good not to share. Finally, once everything was laid down, I coated the model in varnish and came in with some Tamiya panel liner to give the panels some lining. More separation. This really brought out the contrast in the model and gave it a larger than life robot look. So I picked up this model for 53 bucks, which was a pretty sweet deal. But the model was in really bad shape, and I'm not gonna lie, it's still not in the best shape. Some of the damage to this knight was unfortunately irreversible, but with a little bit of fresh paint, some eye-popping weapons, and a super sweet base, I'm hoping that those things will be enough to distract from the defects. And really, the model is at least in a condition that I wouldn't be sad to play this at a local club any day of the week. But of course, you'll have to let me know what you think down in the comments. But of course, before you do that though, check out this newly resurrected Wraithknight. Thank you again for joining me on another miniature rescue. I do hope you enjoyed something about this video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, as it really helps out the channel. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video.